Hello and welcome to another edition of SME Business TV with Frankie Goodman and myself, Nigel Whittaker. Today we're interviewing Andrew Raby from Thackray Williams. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Nigel. Hi, Frankie.
Good morning.
Andrew, you deal with residential properties. There's quite a few new rules out there in residential at the moment. What's the main ones that have changed?
Yeah, that's certainly true, Nigel. A lot of my work is dealing with difficult tenants under assured short-hold tenancy agreements, which is pretty much the default tenancy agreement that everyone uses these days when they're letting an investment property or a property they've inherited. And several weeks ago now, when the crisis was really beginning to hit, the government made an announcement that they were going to pass some legislation to ensure that, in effect, no renter, either in the social sector or private accommodation, was going to be forced out of their home as a result of this crisis. And what they've actually done is produce some legislation which came into force on the 27th of March, so nearly a couple of weeks ago now. And what that has done is to stay all current possession proceedings in the county court so that they can't progress. So wherever that action had reached, whether you were waiting for a possession order or whether you had a possession order and you were waiting for example, a bailiff appointment, or you had a bailiff appointment where the bailiff was on the verge of evicting your tenant, all those actions are stayed. And they're stayed for 90 days, so taking us through to the 25th of June. So for the moment, nothing is happening with those actions. The government actually indicated that it was going to prevent any new possession actions being issued. That doesn't appear to have come into force, although there's some guidance suggesting you shouldn't try and issue a claim. But if you're in a situation where you might have served notice on your tenant before this crisis emerged and that notice has now expired, and ordinarily you'd be going on to issue a claim in the county court, it appears that potentially you could still complete the forms, send them into court, pay an issue fee. I suspect that if anyone tries to do that, one of two things will happen. Either the court will issue the claim and then immediately stay it, so it'll be stayed, but nothing will happen for 90 days or until the 25th of June at least. Or they may just send the papers back. I mean, some of the courts are actually closed anyway, so if you're issuing in a jurisdiction where your county court is closed, then it's not going to get issued, it's just going to come back to you in the post, I guess. But for the moment, the guidance is not to issue any claims. What the government has also done is to change the rules or the law in terms of any notice you might serve. So you could potentially serve a notice on your tenant at the moment if you wanted to, but that would typically be either a Section 21 notice or a Section 8 notice under the Housing Act 1988. Both those notices previously, Section 8 had to run for 14 days, Section 21, the more typical notice, had to run for 2 months. Both notices have been extended to 3 months. So if you did want to serve a notice on your tenant at the moment, then it has to be for a 3-month period, which I guess coincides roughly with this 90-day stay. The one thing I would say is there's been some guidance published by the government, so non-statutory guidance, so it's not actual law, but the guidance suggests that landlords should not really even serve notices at the moment unless there's some exceptional reason for doing so. The other thing that's quite interesting is, I think, from probably any landlord's point of view who might be having a tenant who may be saying, well, I can't pay the rent or I've got a problem now, the further guidance has been that tenants should continue to pay their rent, but if they're in difficulty because of the virus pandemic, then they should be talking to their landlords to try and agree something. And landlords are being encouraged to be flexible and to agree a sensible way forward, or as in quotation marks I've read, an affordable repayment plan. I mention all that because I rather felt that when I saw some of this guidance being publicised and talked about in the media, it was presented, I thought, in a slightly misleading way, in that I think even a sensible and reasonable tenant could have understood understood that perhaps for 3 months they just didn't have to pay rent. That isn't the case. The guidance is that they should pay their rent if they possibly can. If they are affected by the virus and they're not working at the moment, or they've been furloughed, or maybe they've lost their job, then they certainly need to be talking to their landlord. And if the landlord or if the tenant has actually lost their job and they really are financially in trouble, then they should definitely make an application to Universal Credit or for Universal Credit, because the government put aside a pretty large sum of money into Universal Credit to try and help tenants. The idea being that not only are tenants not losing their home, but landlords don't go short in terms of rent, or shouldn't do. How that will work in practice, who knows?
Andrew, I should imagine most landlords will want to look after good tenants who've genuinely hit a tough time at the moment, especially the self-employed. I've got one who's self-employed, won't be getting his money until June. So you just have to make allowance for that and get the money in June. But how about for bad tenants who are already behind, with being difficult about paying? Have they now got carte blanche to just not pay and they can't be thrown out?
Yeah, they can't be evicted. I agree. It's a difficult one. I think there's likely to be tenants who will be, shall we say, opportunistic about this, and suddenly think, well, I'm going to say I can't afford rent and I'm not going to pay. The reality is that there are bad tenants out there. I say that because I'm somebody who generally comes across them, because most of the work I do comes to me through landlords who have got a serious problem with their tenants. I tend to deal with the serious ones. And I know that, some people will, if you like, play the system or try and play the system. At the moment, yes, those tenants are going to be a problem, because landlords shouldn't be serving notices according to the guidance, but as I say, you can if there are exceptional circumstances. But those notices are going to run for 3 months as a minimum, so you're not going to be able to evict your tenant anytime soon. I mean, I can tell you a particular case of mine. Obviously won't give you real detail, but I was due to be in court, one of the county courts, next week on a possession hearing for a landlord client of mine who owns just an investment property as part of his general income, I think. The tenant stopped paying rent a number of months ago. We served the Section 8 notice. We issued possession proceedings. The possession hearing was scheduled for next week. I got a notice through from the court yesterday, in keeping with the current new legislation, which basically adjourns next week's hearing. But what was, I thought, pretty shocking was, rather than adjourning it to the end of the current stay of 25th June, the hearing's been adjourned off until the 30th of October. So that's another 6 and a bit months, during which time I doubt very much this tenant is going to pay any rent to my landlord. And to be candid, even if we manage to get that matter listed for a hearing again in, say, December, which frankly probably isn't going to be realistic given what the court lists are going to be like at that time, I think it's unrealistic to anticipate we'll get that tenant out using the court process until the early part of next year. And that is a lot of rent arrears.
Yeah, a whole year.
Well, I think that's probably going to be the reality, unless we can somehow bring a hearing forward, which currently we're not going to be able to do. In terms of what do you do in that situation if you're a landlord, I think the only thing you can really do at this stage is you've got to try and open up a channel of communication with your tenant, try and work out with the tenant what is happening. That may not always be possible, but for example, if they are able to claim universal credit, if that's an issue, then encourage them to do so. If you become aware of the fact they're already claiming universal credit, or they're already on benefits of some sort, and they're not paying what they should be paying onto you as landlord, at least some of that money, then there's no harm in trying to contact the local authority direct to see if you can open up a channel of communication there. I don't personally do that for clients, so I've got no real experience of that, but anecdotally, from what I'm told by people, that sometimes works quite well, but other times it's almost impossible to communicate. So that's the real downside at the moment, where a client has, a landlord has a tenant who is not paying. But I agree with your earlier comment, though, Nigel, that a lot of landlords, a lot of tenants are good tenants, good landlords, and they'll communicate with each other and they'll work something out. I think something I would say, though, is that, again, this is from experience of dealing with good tenants who find themselves in difficulty in normal times, maybe they get made redundant or whatever. You've always got to be a little bit wary about deferring rent or paying a reduced rent figure with your landlord, because the longer that goes on, the more the arrears build up, even if you are paying, say, half your rent, but half is not getting paid, and the months rack up. And before you know it, you've been paying half rent for 6 months. So effectively, you've got 3 months rent arrears. And then you get in a position where you are working again, hopefully, and income is coming in. And you can agree something with your landlord to pay current rent in full plus something off the arrears. But it can take time. And sometimes people even people who are quite good at managing their finances can suddenly find themselves in a position where they're always behind, and it takes a long time to catch up.
I've actually reduced the rent to my tenants, and just reduced it. I'm not expecting it back afterwards. Just during this lockdown period, they've got a slightly lower rent than they had previously. I'm very lucky. I've got some really good tenants. One of them, as I said, won't be able to pay until he gets some money in June, but I totally trust them. But I didn't realise how serious the situation it was for some landlords. You've got a bad payer, it could be a year's time before you can do anything about it.
Well, not so much a year's time before you can do something about it, but certainly potentially a long time before you can actually finally get that property back in your hands, vacant possession, and you're able to relet it or sell it, whatever you want to do with it. But I think those are going to be the extreme cases, but they will exist for sure. But I think, as always, even in normal times, communication between landlord and tenant is absolutely key. I mean, it sounds like you've got a good relationship with your tenants. If you've got a good relationship, if you've got good communication, most people can work something out, even if it's quite a lengthy period of time that somebody's going to be repaying the arrears. I mean, I've come across one or two other people who've said, look, let's just reduce the rent for now, and I won't expect that reduction to be repaid at any stage. We just forget that, and then we return to normal rental in June, July, or whenever things start getting back to normal. I think that's great. The only thing I would say about that is, I think it's always worthwhile recording that somewhere, or recording it somehow, even if it's just a simple email between you and the tenant, or the tenant and the landlord, because then there is a record of what was agreed and what both parties understood. Because with the best will in the world, people's memories are not always accurate, and genuinely not always accurate, and there can be misunderstandings which can then sour the relationship between landlord and tenant going forward. So I think it's always sensible just to have a simple email exchange confirming what you've agreed. If you're agreeing that look, for the next 3 months don't pay me any rent, but it's understood that the rent is not waived, the rent is still got to be paid in the future, but we'll agree that from plucking figures out there, or dates out there, from July or August or September, that you're back to paying full rent plus £250 a month off the arrears until the arrears are reduced to zero. If that works, it should work well.
Frankie, you've been looking up online some of the commonly asked questions. Have you got one there?
Well, actually, one very much relates to what we've just said there, really, and actually it's part of the bigger picture. And I think it's quite easy to focus on those bad tenants, but I think almost the usually good tenant who feels like they're ethical and a genuine, decent person, they are not so used to falling into a position where they can't pay. And the question that we seem to be seeing a lot online at the moment is, I've got a very good tenant, normally everything's smooth, normally very good payers, been in my property for a long time. However, payment hasn't reached me this month. It seems like they've cancelled the direct debit. I've had no communication from them. I understand actually that this could be part of the COVID-19 situation, and it might be that they need some help, but without any communication, what should I do? What sort of the guidance and best advice on that scenario when you have got a good tenant? You know, they're a little bit embarrassed about their situation. They don't want to communicate it, and then all of a sudden the landlord doesn't receive their money.
Well, I think first thing to say is just focusing on the tenant. I think it's unwise for any tenant to just simply not pay or stop paying without any explanation, because you're going to immediately make any discussion with your landlord trickier than it might have been. I would say that we're in a very weird world at the minute. All sorts of people are going to have some financial issues either now, immediately, or as this carries on. And any tenant who has got any kind of issue overpaying rent, or indeed any issue with the property they're renting, the top tip, it's not really top tip, it's just common sense, is pick up the phone to your landlord, talk to your landlord and raise the issue and explains what's happening. I mean, in normal times, if a tenant, for example, suddenly is made redundant, it can happen to anyone, should talk to their landlord and say, well, this is the situation I'm in. I think I'm going to get another job pretty soon. I can cover the rent for the next few months. I just want to let you know, but I may need a bit of flexibility. And most landlords, sensible landlords, will respond positively to that. So I think the first thing is, as a tenant, don't just stop paying the rent. Talk to the landlord and explain why you haven't paid, or why you're not going to be able to pay, or can you pay half? From the other point of view, where a landlord has suddenly checked their bank account and found, oh, the rent's not come in, I think the answer is it would be the same even if we were not in this crisis. It's immediately pick up the phone to the tenant, talk to the tenant, find out what the issue is. Don't sit on your hands thinking, well, I'll wait a month and see, whether they contact me, or see whether the rent comes in next month. React straight away. Communicate with them, find out what the issue is, draw it out, and say to them, if this is to do with certainly if it's to do with COVID-19, say to them, what's the position, what's happened to your employment, have you been furloughed, so are you getting some money, have you actually lost your job, so income has just suddenly stopped, and have that conversation. I'm not recommending going around knocking on the door, because at the moment, partly because of the social distancing, that's not to be recommended. But try and communicate with the tenant, get that channel of communication open, and have a sensible conversation with them. I mean, as I say, just going back to the guidance is that tenants should continue to pay their rent. But if the virus has affected their ability to pay the rent, then they need to talk to their landlord. That is the government's guidance. Landlords need to try and be flexible, and agree a sensible way forward. If tenants are really on their uppers, they definitely need to apply for universal credit. It should be more available to more people than it was. Landlords, if this is an investment property where they have a mortgage, the government's made it clear that the extra money they're making available to allow people to sort of defer mortgage payments or have a mortgage holiday is available for people with buy-to-let mortgages, as well as people who on their mortgages in the houses they live in. So there's been money set aside for that. So if a landlord, and some will be, is under pressure because the rent has stopped or is not coming in the same level, then landlords should explore those opportunities as well. I certainly had experience of dealing with landlords who perhaps new landlords. They've never been landlords before. They've in the past they thought, oh, great idea to buy an investment property. Well, it's a good investment and we'll get rental income. And they perhaps don't have, if they've got a mortgage on that property, they may well not have much resilience, shall we say, to a month or two's rent arrears. So they need to be talking to their mortgagees on that property.
Do you think there's a bit of a duty there for landlords to actually pass on some of the communications that have come out from the government there? Because a lot of tenants, they've got a lot of their own problems to deal with at the moment, and while you certainly don't want as a landlord to be telling people, yes, you can potentially not pay your rent at the moment, the flip side of that is if you put out a communication saying this is what the current situation is, these are the types of things that are available, but just remember that if you do decide that you want to defer rent or you want to not pay, that has got to be caught up somewhere down the line. And actually that might actually make people think, actually, no, I do still need to make sure I'm paying that money. where I get that money from, whether it be from reserves, savings, whether it be from going out there and actually getting a part-time job in the supermarkets, whatever it may be, rather than just people thinking, oh, it seems like I can just put that rent off at the moment and that's the best idea, that's an easy thing. Is there something that you think landlords maybe should be doing to, help communicate what is actually the process at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And in fact, I think landlords could take the initiative here, be proactive rather than reactive, and ping out an email to their tenant or tenants saying to them, look, this is obviously strange times we're living through here. The government has published some guidance. The guidance does say that you ought to pay your rent and continue to pay rent if you can. But if the virus affects you, then talk to the landlord, talk to me. And in a way, you're beginning, you're already opening up that channel of communication. And a landlord could say, look, if you are in difficulty or you think you're going to be in difficulty over the next few months, tell me now or tell me as soon as you think that's the case, and let's work something out. I'm more than happy to try and work something out because, as Nigel says, if you've got a good tenant, you want to maintain, you don't want to get rid of that tenant or lose that tenant. Far better you keep them for the long term. A good, reliable, low maintenance tenant is great. So yeah, I think it's a great idea for landlords to be proactive. It's not being heavy-handed. You can do it in a way that is being helpful and sensible. And hopefully, a tenant may come back saying, well, it's okay, I'm working, there's no issue. Or, you may hear from a tenant and you've if you like, you've anticipated a problem or you've nipped a problem in the bud before it becomes an issue.
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit where people are maybe not totally remembering the situation we're in at the moment. And because we've all been confined to our homes, everyone feels like this has been going on forever already. But the reality is it hasn't been going on that long.
No, I know.
Businesses have just only passed that month cycle. So, they would have potentially, any business up until the last payday, a week ago, they would have already had the money in the bank to pay for the salaries at the end of the month, potentially. And I would hope that the vast majority did. I think now we're just getting to that point where they've now got to start falling on their reserves. And I think only now we're going to start seeing more businesses feel that pressure and make quite difficult decisions as to what they now want to do with the staff, and certainly in the months moving forward. So I think although it seems at the moment to everybody like this has been going on forever, I think we're very early on in the process. And I think certainly that taking that initiative and preparing for the fact that, businesses are going to start feeling that pinch a lot more over the next probably 6 to 8 weeks, by sort of putting out that communication and letting people know that you're there, I think is really important. And the other question that is coming up at the moment is there are people who paid deposits on properties that they were moving into and hadn't moved into them yet. And there's still probably a lot of people stuck in that limbo situation at the moment. And, from what I've been having a little look around online there are people who are saying, well, they've turned around to me and said that I can't actually move into the property at the moment because things have happened, which means either the existing tenants are not moving out because they've had a problem with their process or whatever it may be. And sort of landlords have been paid those deposits and the tenants are feeling like that deposit's being held and that's their money that they could do with right now. And maybe actually they don't want to move anymore. So that seems like some really unusual ground that people are sort of experiencing at the moment, and wonder if you've got any thoughts around that.
Yeah, just going back to that, the first thing you said there about communication, landlord to tenant. I did touch on this earlier. I certainly felt that the way in which this message about tenants, not paying rent came out did feel to me as if some tenants, even genuine tenants not trying to be opportunistic, might have understood that message to be saying they don't have to pay rent for 3 months. And it may well be that people paying mortgages had a similar view initially. So I think the communication from the landlord should be in part to perhaps correct that in case a tenant is thinking that, because that isn't the guidance at all. Moving on to your question about what if I've effectively committed to taking on a new tenancy before this blew up and now I can't move in. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've had a couple of queries on that just this week. One, almost exactly the scenario you were describing, where a tenancy agreement had been signed and they were due to move in a week or so ago, and they hadn't been able to, and they were thinking, well, do I really want to now, because can I commit to this because I know my income's coming down. And another situation was where actually I know tenants who've moved into a property and now seemingly want to get out of it, and they're actually physically in there already. The tenancy has started, and it's not quite clear why they want to go. But I'm acting for landlord on that, and it did occur to me that they might be thinking that they can't commit. You know, they've taken on a commitment they can't meet, and so it might actually be better for everyone if they do go. I mean, those sort of cases, they're very fact specific, so it's going to be difficult for me to give definitive guidance on that. You know, every case will be that different. The one I was just touching on, where the person had signed the tenancy agreement, for example, they hadn't paid a deposit pursuant to the tenancy agreement. They hadn't paid their first month's rent. They haven't moved in yet. They had paid what you might loosely call a holding deposit to the letting agent, which was just a few hundred quid to the agent several weeks ago, to sort of have that give them the option to take a tenancy of that property. So that's not really part of isn't part of the tenancy agreement. And in that scenario, for example, the agent hadn't actually given the keys over to the tenants and had said to them, we're not going to give you the keys until you pay the deposit under the tenancy and the first month's rent. And the person raising the query with me was saying, look, you know, I don't think I can commit to this anymore. What's the position? And there's a number of arguments either way on that, legal arguments. But again, I think I would say in the first instance, talk to the agent, the landlord. You know, you might think, well, actually I do want the property, in which case you could say to them, can we defer it, defer the start of the tenancy, that is, and pick this up in a month's time, 2 months time, whatever. Because generally speaking, a lot of people probably can't move at the moment. I mean, I understand anecdotally that some removal firms are still working, but I also understand that some are not. So if you've actually got to move house or move into a new property, that could be tricky. On the other side of the coin, and you touched on this, I'm sure there are landlords out there who were expecting tenants to move out this month, and arrangements being made for that, and a new tenant had been found, and in fact they're stuck. The tenant can't move out. So, you know, it's a real problem. I think communication is going to be key. But from a landlord's point of view, the difficulty with where you've got a tenant who's given notice and hasn't moved out, there's a few legal arguments that could be run there. But of course, the client, the landlord client, can't evict them at the moment. They just can't, because the possession proceedings are stayed. So there's a lot of issues that are going to blow up, and I think people, certainly in the first instance and for now, are going to have to try and be sensible and communicate with each other and come to some sort of flexible and sensible way forward.
Yeah.
Andrew, by the sounds of what you're saying, there's certainly going to be some landlords who end up in a situation where they're not paid for rent for a long period. I gave an example earlier. Has there been any guidance around landlords like that who haven't got the resilience, that when it comes to the fact they haven't been paying their mortgage, and it may have gone on for almost a year, that the courts would be a bit more lenient in not doing repossessions for the banks?
Yeah, I think there's, I don't know about specific guidance in terms of mortgage arrears cases, but I am on the basis that the general thrust of what the government's done is that there's going to be, nobody should be evicted at the moment, certainly in terms of tenants is concerned. I think that it's unlikely that any mortgagor or person living in their property paying a mortgage is going to be evicted anytime soon. And yeah, I think there is going to be some flexibility there. I think the judiciary are going to be reluctant to make any possession orders of that kind at the moment. And, you know, the banks, the mortgage lenders are all being encouraged to be flexible. I mean, where you're dealing with a landlord, say, who has a mortgage on their rental property and the rent has stopped or has dried up, then they should be talking to the mortgagee, looking about a mortgage holiday. I mean, the example I gave earlier of a client of mine where the possession hearing next week has been adjourned, where if that particular individual or someone like that was under some particular stress with their current mortgage, then they should be talking to the mortgagees and basically saying, look, I'm doing everything I can to get this person out, but at the moment I can't.
So
and that's the reality.
I've applied to my mortgagee for a break, done it on a form, which is what they've put out. There's an online form. I've had no acknowledgement at all. You certainly can't get through to them on the telephone at the moment. But there's just nothing coming from Barclays at all at the moment.
No, there's something on the news about that. No, so I think it was it the CEO of RBS being interviewed, or HSBC, I can't remember. And they were saying that, on their call centre, they normally get 3,000 calls a day. And in recent weeks, they've been getting 25,000. So they're trying to shift resources into that to field more calls. And they were acknowledging that they have been slow, almost inevitably, I guess, to start releasing money, but it is now starting to happen. And I guess in terms of contacting your mortgagee, probably people having the same problem. I mean, I'm not really in a position to advise on that, but I guess the sensible course would be that if this is something you've done in your case, Nigel, I think all you can do is make sure you complete the forms they ask you to complete, do everything that you're expected to do, and make sure you do it promptly. And then you're sitting and waiting, I guess, to see what happens. But I guess, like everything at the moment, or like most things, there's going to be huge delays in doing all these things because of the increase in numbers of people making applications. I mean, I think, was it the stat last week that there'd been something like 1 million or close to 1 million applications for new applications for universal credit last week, which is, as I understand it, completely unprecedented. Those numbers are just crazy. But I guess that's the scenario we're in.
Are there any other areas you'd like to cover, Andrew?
There's I suppose two additional thoughts. One is in relation just dealing with tenancies. Something that may crop up as a practical point is that despite the virus, properties are still going to occasionally need a repair or a bit of maintenance, and a landlord's obligations to carry out the repairs they're meant to do are still going to be in place. But the guidance that's been given on that is that, provided tenants should notify landlords if there's a problem, if there's a repair that needs undertaking, which is the landlord's responsibility, and they should give access to landlords to carry out repairs if it's safe and reasonable to do it. And that seems to be the general gist of this, is that if a repair is capable of being dealt with reasonably and safely, allowing for social distancing, etc., then try and organise it. And there's going to have to be flexibility between landlord and tenant. But I guess some tenants may have a minor repair that a landlord might normally fix very promptly, but it just may not be possible to get it done at the moment. So again, there's going to have to be communication, tolerance, bit of flexibility. The only other thing I was going to mention was another part of my work is supporting managing agents, managing large blocks of residential flats where the flats are usually let on long leases. I've had some contact with some managing agents I deal with, and they're concerned that lessees are not going to be paying service charges, or just going to think, we won't pay service charges. Again, I think the general rule or guidance is, or should be, if you can pay, you should pay. If you can't, and there's a problem, communicate with the agent and let them know. Because I think otherwise, again, there's just arrears going to build up. And when we finally get through all of this, there's going to be some people facing significant arrears. So if you can pay, I think you should.
Frankie, any more questions to Andrew? No, I think that's pretty clear for me. I think that the only sort of, and I'm not sure this is something that you get involved with on a regular basis, but obviously Nigel's in a position, my mum's in this position as well, and they're obviously a demographic of people that get forgotten slightly, and that's people who rent rooms in their own homes. And if you have a vulnerable person within your home and the person who's renting a room from you is a key worker, That obviously, and I've had a conversation recently about that as well. Luckily, my mum's not in that position, but I said, you know, what would you do if you was in that scenario? How would you feel about that? Or if you are the tenant and somebody is a key worker in the family, my stepfather's a fireman, they're being put in a position where they may even have to pick up the bodies at the moment, take them to morgues and so on. It's a terrible situation they're being put into, and not many people are aware fire brigade need to do that. But on that basis, if you are, you know, renting that room out and you'll feel like that person is a risk to a vulnerable person in your family, well, what sort of best guidance and advice around that?
Blimey, that's quite tricky. I mean, I mean, for a lot of people, they wouldn't have anywhere else to go, would they? So you know, and you certainly can't. I don't see that you can just. I'm not suggesting people would do this, but somebody might. I don't think you can just sort of change the locks and stop them coming in and prevent them coming in, because that would be effectively an illegal eviction, and you're putting yourself at risk to a damages claim in due course. You know, and I'm not holding myself out as being an expert on the social distancing and isolation and all the rest of it under COVID-19. But I guess, again, it's a communication issue. You may end up having to somehow isolate within the property, but I can see that could be incredibly difficult. I mean, I've seen things in the newspaper where somebody who is a key worker has been, you know, sleeping in the caravan in the garden if they've got a caravan or something like that, and you know, the rest of the family sort of delivering meals to their door, and them, you know, living and eating in the caravan. But I guess you do your best to isolate as far as you can and explore options as to whether or not, you know, maybe that key worker could move somewhere else temporarily, or you know, depending on the circumstances, whether the non-key workers would have alternative accommodation available. But that's tricky.
No, I think that's really good and sensible advice. And the reason why I asked that question, I know it's a difficult question, so apologies for throwing that out there, but it's because I think people are taking very sort of making very quick decisions at the moment. And, you know, it may be a case where somebody doesn't think of all the potential options that are available. And I think you're right. I think, you know, erring on the side of caution, you know, if they are usually used to using certain elements of the house, using certain areas of the house, you know, how can you limit that? How can you work something out together to just say, look, you know, we don't want to make a difficult decision. We don't want you to have to leave. However, if we all put our heads together and use common sense, and we actually say, look, if you do need something, you know, my mum's got somebody there. They've moved a fridge up into their room, so they've got stuff that they can have, and they don't have to go to the kitchen as often. Stuff. It's not saying you can't use the kitchen, but it was just saying let's limit things as much as possible. You know, they've made a rule of when they enter the home, shoes must be taken off, hands must be washed, all those sort of things, and just said, look, you know, let's be sensible about it. And I think that's important, because I think there are people out there who have unfortunately been put in that situation where the tenants made it really difficult for them. The landlords made it really difficult for them, and they feel like they've had no other option but to go somewhere else. And I think that, you know, we should be pulling together a little bit more than that at the moment.
No, I agree. So you know, this isn't new to COVID-19. It seems that a lot of the things I get involved in, you know, it's all about communication, and early and good and sensible communication can often stop what might have turned into a big issue and a big problem becoming that. But you know, it always, with communication, always takes two to tango, doesn't it? You know, there's got to be goodwill and flexibility on both sides. But yeah, we are in it, living through extraordinary times, and you'd like to think that most people currently will be as sensible and flexible as they possibly can be, because you know, there's going to be all sorts of problems arising where, you know, maybe there isn't actually any formal guidance or legislation, whatever, and you just think, right, we've just got to work out a sensible way forward, as you say.
Andrew, thank you very much for the guidance today. That was really useful, I'm sure, for an awful lot of landlords and probably tenants out there as well. So thank you.
Hope so. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheerio.